So let's get started. And if any of you guys have got any questions, any thoughts about Nietzsche, just because there's only a few of us, I've got a bunch of stuff I've got sort of semi-prepared. If we go off course, if you're just like, hey, what about this? I'm perfectly happy just being a bit random. So book section 3. Oh, sorry, I need to. I've lost the share. Oh, and I've still lost it. Sorry. I've got so many tabs open. Do you have that? That you have the kind of tabs from hell? Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so today I want to talk about book 3 of the genealogy. And the first thing I wanted to talk about, was the beginning of book 3. So in his preface, so there's a sort of interpretive puzzle about book 3. In his preface to the genealogy that I didn't give you to read, basically Nietzsche says that the whole of the third essay is a sort of commentary on the aphorism that appears at the beginning of the essay. And so people read this quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra: unconcerned, mocking, violent, thus wisdom wants us. She is a woman and always loves only a warrior. Now, if we take the preface seriously, it's very difficult to see how, and he says in the preface that the whole of book 3 can be thought of as a sort of commentary on the aphorism at the beginning. And it's very difficult to see how it's a commentary. The whole thing is a commentary on this aphorism. Yeah. There are sort of this little aphorism from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, of course, does have some relevance to the themes. I mean, what do you think Nietzsche means by this? And what's it got to do with the idea in the genealogy? Wisdom is a woman and she loves only a warrior. I mean, if we think about the warrior, maybe you've got something about the noble morality. You've got this idea of sort of confidence and self-affirmation. Yeah. So the sort of self-denying, weaselly little sort of scholar, the kind of 19th century bureaucrat scholar, the scholastic guy who's just in there collecting notes. I think Nietzsche, you might think it's got to do with something like that. You might think that we might think that what does wisdom love? Who loves wisdom? A philosopher loves wisdom. So the philosopher loves wisdom, but who does wisdom love? Well, wisdom loves this sort of this person who's in some sense full of self-affirmation rather than self-denial. This is the idea. So you might think that, well, there's a way of reading this as having to do with the whole of book 3 is really about this, because in some sense you might think that book 3, what emerges from it is something about the ideal of the philosopher. Yeah. And so really what book 3 is about is, what is it to be a philosopher really? Yeah. And a real philosopher loves wisdom, and wisdom loves, I think, him back for Nietzsche. I think it's very gendered. Yeah. But I think the sort of idea is that if you're a philosopher and you love wisdom, what happens if you love wisdom and wisdom hates you because you're just a kind of pathetic kind of specimen? This is, yeah, so I think there is a way of kind of interpreting book 3 about this. And in particular, towards the end of book 3, we go through these various examples of self-denial. So aesthetic is opposed to aesthetic. Aesthetic has got to do with beauty. Aesthetic ideals are ideals of self-denial. So he goes through book 3, looking at various types of self-denial. Yeah, and he looks at the priest. He looks at the sort of artist like Schopenhauer, who's got a sort of aesthetics of self-denial. He looks at the sort of humdrum herd mentality person who sort of lives their life in self-denial. But the sort of culmination of this analysis is the idea that the scientist and perhaps the philosopher has an ideal of self-denial. And in particular, he sort of argues towards the end in Numbers 20, about 24, 25, he talks about the will to truth. And he compares the will to truth with the will to deception, and says that the will to truth is a form of self-denial. Yeah. And the will to deception we might think of as poetry, fiction, the artist, yeah, the true artist. And, you know, elsewhere, like in the gay science, he sort of promoted this idea of the philosopher, the scientist, as in some sense embracing both of these things. Yeah, having a scientific mentality, but also being a poet. Yeah, and so Nietzsche, one way of reading this is Nietzsche's ideal is the sort of philosopher poet, and wisdom, you know, the philosopher loves wisdom, but wisdom doesn't love the boring analytic philosopher. Who wisdom loves is the sort of sexy murder poet. Yeah, that's what who wisdom wants. Yeah. So I think there is a way of reading the book as in some sense an interpretation of this aphorism. I think though that there's been a sort of new interpretation of Nietzsche, and I think the new standard way to read book 3 and the claim that the whole of book 3 is the interpretation of the aphorism at the beginning is that what he's talking about is section 1 of book 3. And I think there's some evidence that initially the quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra wasn't initially included in the manuscript. Yeah, and it was sort of added later. And I take it that in this first section, he asked about what is the meaning of aesthetics ideals. And he talks about various characters who can be thought of as manifesting this sort of self-denial. So aesthetic ideals are ideals of self-denial. And of course, remember, he started off with the idea of there's these two different systems of values. One of them is a sort of an ethics of saying no. This is the kind of modern Christian ethics. But then on the other hand, you've got the sort of noble system of valuation, which starts off with something like self-affirmation. So he says, you know, we've got artists who can manifest self-denial. And he's going to, in the first sections, he's going to look at Wagner and Schopenhauer as kind of examples of this sort of aesthetic self-denial. We've got philosophers and scholars. He's going to talk about philosophers and scholars quite a lot, especially towards the end of the essay 3, when he talks about the will to truth. Yeah, and he talks a lot about the scholars. He talks about women. So you've got artists, philosophers, scholars. These are all different cases. And then you've got women. And so we've got self-denial, we've got this we've got the idea of the physiologically deformed and deranged. Yeah, this is going to be sort of the herd, modern democratic European middle class, yeah, who just go to work every day and make a living. And Nietzsche thinks these people are just deformed and deranged. They're living this life of, they deny all of their instincts in order, not even to kind of, in the sake of some ideal like truth, but they do it for a salary so that they can, I don't know, buy televisions. It's like, yeah, yeah. And then we have the saintly, yeah, yeah. So we've got all of these examples of character types who manifest this aesthetic ideal, self-denial. Yeah, and this is, I think, what the whole thing is about. And then he says that, and this is, I think, the kind of main topic of the essay. And so we can think of the whole essay, given what he says in the preface about the whole essay being a sort of commentary, he says what he offers in essay 3 is an ideal of interpretation, where you've got an aphorism, and then the whole essay is the interpretation of a single aphorism. And I take it, along with a bunch of contemporary Nietzsche scholars, that rather than taking the quote at the beginning, it's really this paragraph, the whole of section 1 of essay 3, that the whole essay is a commentary on. And in particular, we have this idea, at the end, he said, that the aesthetic ideal has meant so many things to man, however, is an expression of the basic fact of the human will. It's horror vacui. It's horror of a vacuum. Yeah, the human will needs a goal, and the human will rather will nothing than not will. Am I understood? Have I been understood? Yeah. Then he says, not at all, my dear sir. Then let's start again from the beginning. Yeah. And I think this final sentence of this first paragraph is really saying, yeah, now I'm going to try and explain everything. Basically, the whole of the rest of the essay is an attempt to hash out what I've just tried to say in this previous paragraph. Yeah. So the whole, my reading and the reading of a bunch of more recent Nietzsche scholars like Ken Gibbs is that the whole of the essay is a sort of commentary on this first section. So before working our way through it, I wanted to go to the end. Yeah, so the final section is section, is it 28? Yeah. So the final section of the of this section of the whole book is a return to the final sentence, or the penultimate sentence of the first paragraph. Yeah, it's like the culmination. And he says, you know, like that and I think we've talked about this earlier when we were talking about the meaning of suffering, but I'm just going to come back and remind you of it, that, you know, that apart from the aesthetic ideal, man, the human animal, had no meaning so far. So that these ideals that are but essentially ideals of self-denial are ideals that give our life meaning. Yeah, that we use these ideals to interpret our lives, to interpret our suffering, and to give ourselves meaning. So we would, you know, if self-denial gives our life some sort of meaning, yeah, gives it some interpretation that makes sense to us, then that this self-denial is far better than self-affirmation. Yeah, because I think this is where he's like Hegel, we're these self-interpreting animals, and that not only do we have to live, but we have to kind of reflect on our own life and existence. And this sort of self-reflection is essentially a form of sort of self-interpretation. Yeah, so we spend our lives trying to come up with some sort of self-interpretation, some sort of interpretation of our lives, our suffering, and the like. And and we'd rather live lives that make sense than lives that are sort of easy. But like we go to work, we get out of bed in the morning, we do all sorts of shit we don't do. Yeah, in order to, because we've got some sort of goal. Yeah, that gives our life meaning. So he says, man does not repudiate suffering, he desires it, he seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it. Yeah, that this is a sort of a form of nihilism, and then he finishes the whole essay. Yeah, he finishes the whole essay by saying, we can no longer conceal from ourselves what is expressed by all that willing which has taken its direction from the ascetic ideal. This hatred of the human and even more of the animal. Yeah, so we affirm our sort of supernatural being, our abstract being, our ideal of ourselves, and in so doing, we kind of deny our actuality. We affirm this sort of abstract ideal, and this involves a sort of hatred of the human, even more of the animal. And we'll look at the various ways Nietzsche thinks this human self-hatred is sort of manifested. And once again, I think this is kind of, once again, very close to Hegel. So, Hegel has this thing about his criticisms of the French Revolution, that willing an abstraction seems like we're willing something positive, but really what we're doing is we're saying no to what's actual. And I think Nietzsche's got a very similar sort of criticism of the philosophical will to truth. Yeah, we have this abstract idea of truth, and this is what drives us. And in some sense, in willing this ideal, the idea of science, this implicitly involves denying our drives. Yeah, that we sort of deny our will to interpretation. We deny our creative side in the face of this scientific ideal. Yeah, so these aesthetic ideals involve this hatred of the human, even more of the animal, and more still of the material. This horror of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this longing to get away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wishing, from longing itself. All of this means, let us dare to grasp it, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life. But it is and remains a will. So this will against the will is itself affirming the will. Yeah, because it's driven by a desire to will, Nietzsche thinks. Yeah, and so to repeat in conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothingness than not will. Yeah, so I take it that that we have the end of the first section, we have the end of the whole essay and the whole book. He repeats this single phrase, and then in the preface, he tells us that the whole of the essay number 3 is an attempt to unpack a particular aphorism. And I think if anything's the candidate for this, it's this claim that man would rather will nothingness than not will. So I think that's my sort of framing of the key sort of claim in book 3. Of course, willing nothingness, the Latin for nothing is nihil, yeah. And so willing nothingness is nihilism. Yeah. So, and one of the themes of the whole 3 essays has got to do with what he takes to be European nihilism and decadence. Yeah. And so Nietzsche is offering a sort of, you might think then that what he's offering in book 3 is the sort of beginning of a sort of analysis or a diagnosis of European nihilism. Yeah, that's the sort of what I take to be the sort of key theme. And nihilism, it turns out, for Nietzsche, has many manifestations. So he's going to look at all of these different phenomena that on the surface appear quite different. And the claim is going to be that these are all manifestations of nihilism. Now, this will to this claim that we would rather will nothingness and will nothing than not will at all. I think a version of this is that we'd rather will our pain than not feel pain at all. Yeah. And so I think that part of this is tied to the story in book 2 about bad conscience involving interpreting our own suffering as punishment. And I think and so I've always been a bit confused about this claim in hold on, where am I? Sorry, I've just got to find the. Yeah, I've always been a bit confused about this claim in 320 that. So this is, where am I? Yeah, so in 320, he's talking about the aesthetic ideal. And then he has this passage about us interpreting our suffering as punishment. And this seems to me to really lie at the heart of his understanding of bad conscience. Yeah, so in essay number 2, the theme of essay number 2, the main topic there, has been the idea of guilt. And the question was, where does the feeling of guilt come from? What's the origin of this feeling? Yeah, so Nietzsche wants to offer what we might think of as a sort of naturalistic account of the origin of the feeling of guilt, an account of guilt that doesn't appeal to God or anything supernatural. So the old story was it's a consciousness of sin, and consciousness of sin it's got this kind of deep metaphysical side to it. It's got to do with our separation from God in some sense, our disobedience to God, our sort of break with the divine, our break with being. Yeah. Nietzsche doesn't want to offer a sort of metaphysical interpretation. So Nietzsche kind of is offering a sort of a psychological interpretation of where this feeling of guilt comes from. And of course, his story is that it comes from repression, that we're not allowed to act on our inclinations within society. We have to repress them. Yeah. And so rather than dominating externally, we kind of turn inwards and we sort of dominate ourselves. We scratch at ourselves like cage animals scratch at themselves. So and here in this section, he's talking about the aesthetic priest. And I think this section for me is really the culmination of essay 2. It's really, we can't really fully understand essay 2 without understanding this paragraph. And I take it, I've always wondered why he didn't just put it in essay 2. This just seems, it really should be in essay 2. And I take it the sort of thought he's got is that he thinks that the reader can't really understand this culmination of essay 2 until he's kind of pushed the idea that, we'd rather will nothing than not will at all. Yeah. Anyway, so this is in the middle of essay 3, and he's in the beginning, he looks at aesthetic self-denial. We're going to come back to that. He then talks about priests, and then after talking about the priests, he talks about philosophers and scholars. Yeah, and there he has the long discussion of the will to truth. So this is sort of in the middle of the book. And he says, so he says the chief trick of the aesthetic priest permitted himself for making the human soul resound with heart-rendering aesthetic music of all kinds, as everyone knows, with this exploitation of the sense of guilt. Its origin of guilt, he says, has been briefly suggested in the preceding essay as a piece of animal psychology. No more. There we encountered the sense of guilt in its raw state, so to speak. So here we've got this raw feeling, which I take is the raw material for guilt. It's the dissatisfaction we have as caged animals. He says, it was only in the hands of the priests, that artist in guilty feeling, that it achieved form. Oh, what a form, sin. For this is the priestly name for the animal's bad conscience, cruelty directed backwards. And has been the greatest ever event so far in the history of the sick soul. So this story he's going to tell us now is this kind of the greatest event in the history of the sick soul. We possess it in the most dangerous and fateful artifice of religious interpretation. So this will of the priest is a will that sort of would rather will nothingness than not will at all. And what it wills, you know, what willing, I think, fundamentally is something like interpretation. What the will does is to interpret reality. And this is, I think, the sort of this is the part of Nietzsche that I think was most taken up by the existentialists. So if I teach existentialism, I would do Nietzsche and then Sartre. Yeah, and Sartre has this idea of freedom and the idea of situated freedom. So human freedom is situated. We find ourselves in a world with a body, with people around us, with things that in some sense already have their own meaning. Yeah. And so the question you may ask is, in what sense are we free? Yeah. And sort of Sartre's sort of argument is that we're free to interpret our facticity. Yeah. There are things that are sort of given to us. So for example, you may be a woman and you want to have a child and you find out you're infertile. This is an example that Sartre and de Beauvoir use. Yep. And so you're not free to not be infertile. That's something that's not in your control. But what you are free to do is to interpret your situation. Do you take this to be the kind of the tragic failure of your life? If your goal in life is to be a mother, and if you think that's the most important thing, then you're going to interpret this fact in a certain way. And I think that Nietzsche, like Hegel, following on from Hegel, has this idea that the kind of at the heart of the will is this sort of interpretation. And I think we have sort of drives, and then we interpret things around us in the service of our drives. So, like as Sartre sort of suggests, that given the ends we've set ourselves, things that we find ourselves, situations we find ourselves in, we're going to interpret in different ways. Think about a mountain. Yeah, so he thinks that Sartre, and I think this is something that he's getting from Nietzsche, thinks that like a mountain may be an obstacle. Yeah, but a mountain is only an obstacle in terms of the project of getting from A to B. If you want to get from where you are to the other side of the mountain, then the mountain sort of reveals itself to you as an obstacle. If your project is to have a picnic, then the mountain may present itself to you as a beautiful view. Yeah. So things, the human being is a sort of interpreting and self-interpreting animal. And the sort of interpretations that a human being engages in are interpretations that are in the services of it, as Sartre would say, in the services of our projects. So we have a project, a projection, some sort of goal-directed forward movement, and we interpret things in the light of our projects. I think Nietzsche wants to say something quite similar, but he uses the language of drives. So we have these drives, and these drives provide us with ways of interpreting the world around us. So he says, man suffering from himself in some way or other, but in any case, physiologically, like an animal shut up in a cage. So this is the human condition, the civilized human condition. We're wild animals who have caged ourselves, uncertain why or wherefore, thirsting for reasons relieved, thirsting too for remedies and narcotics, at last takes counsel with one who knows hidden things too. And behold, he receives a hint. He receives from his sorcerer, the ascetic priest, the first hint as to the cause of his suffering. He must seek it in himself in some guilt, in a piece of the past. He must understand his suffering as punishment. Yeah, so the ascetic priest, basically in an act of genius, comes up with an interpretation of suffering that sort of makes sense to people. And it makes sense to people who would rather kind of will nothingness than not will, who would rather kind of will to negate themselves in a certain way, to deny themselves in a certain way than not will at all. Yeah, so I think this passage here is that the priest comes up with an interpretation of the suffering that we feel. Yeah, an interpretation that makes this suffering meaningful. Yeah, and so this, and I think that this is this. So I think Nietzsche thinks that an understanding of guilt isn't really possible in the context of essay number 2, but one needs to kind of get into this context of the argument of the third essay. Okay, that's the first thing I wanted to talk about today. Any thoughts or questions or comments? No? Okay, so if there's no comments, then I'm going to run back to the beginning. Yeah. So, and if you think of any questions or comments, yeah, so let's come back. So I'm not really sure what's going on in the first few sections of essay three. So sections 2, 3, 4, and 5 to me seem a little bit, or the first few sections seem a little bit waffly. So if you've got any thoughts about these sections, I'm just going to jump into section number 5. So if you remember the first sentence of the essay, he says, what is the meaning of aesthetic ideals? And then he says, in the case of artists, they mean nothing or too many things. So the first example he talks about in the opening paragraph is the example of artists and the idea of self-denial in art. And so this turns out to be the kind of topic, I think, of the first few sections. In section number 2, he talks about Wagner. So as a young man, he loved Wagner. He was personal friends with Wagner. He fell in love with Wagner's wife, Cosima Wagner, who sort of flirted with him in a bit in a sort of, oh my God, what a geek, or what a kind of wimp, I don't know. Yeah. And then he sort of split with the Wagners when he became friends with, around the time of becoming friends with Paul Ray. He was sort of disgusted, I think, a bit by Wagner's anti-Semitism. He was always anti-Semitic. So number two, and I think it's interesting that the essay as a whole finishes with a repeat of the final penultimate sentence of the introduction. Essay number two starts with what is the meaning of aesthetic ideals, which is a repeat of the first sentence of section 1. So I think that the sections 2 to 28, it seems to me, are the real essay number 3, and section 1 is a sort of aphorism that stands before it, of which the rest of the essay is an unpacking. So I think if you look at the evidence, I think we've got quite good textual evidence for that. So does anyone know anything about Wagner? So he was very influenced by Schopenhauer. Has anyone ever listened to any music by Wagner? Any of you listened to? So I really liked Wagner. When I was in Berlin, I spent a couple of years living in Berlin, then I would go back every summer to work as a tour guide. And there, if you were a student, you could go to the opera for about 10 euros, 5 euros, depending on the... So I saw the Ring Cycle many times. If you want to get some feel for the kind of mid-Wagner, the Wagner that I think Nietzsche was a big fan of, I think that kind of one of the best things is the opening of Tristan and Isolde. So the prelude to Tristan and Isolde is really, it's just full of this bubbling up of life. I don't know if any of you like music, but when you're reading Nietzsche, listen to some Wagner in the background. It puts you in the right mood. Wagner's music is quite, I think a lot of it kind of starts off slow and quiet, and then kind of, and you have the Ride of the Valkyries, and it just sort of builds up and up and up. It's a bit like a sort of, if you've ever been to a rave and the DJ is kind of getting everyone kind of up and up and up. That's, I think, they're taking a bit of that, I think, from Wagner. And Wagner, was into this kind of complete artwork where you had sound, vision, surrounded by people, and it was you were supposed to be a sort of total immersion type of event. One of the best Wagner things I saw, it was they did it in one of these nightclubs, and they had DJs. And I think most of the people there were on drugs, and they had some of the best opera singers from Berlin and techno DJs doing sort of, the Ring. Really good stuff. But anyway, in his final works, Wagner, in Parsifal, for example, got into sort of chastity. So you have this ideal medieval knight who's this pagan of chastity and of very pure, and so he says, well, what's this crazy stuff when Wagner pays homage to chastity in his old age? So he starts off with a sort of an attack on sort of the later Wagner. He compares the later Wagner with the earlier Wagner. And so if you're interested in Wagner, read the first few sections. He finishes talking about Wagner in section 5, and sort of transitions from talking about Wagner to talking about Schopenhauer and then talking about Kant. So yeah, so one thing is that so Schopenhauer had this sort of view. So Wagner liked Schopenhauer, and he was sort of introduced to Schopenhauer by Nietzsche. And Schopenhauer had this philosophy of pessimism. So Schopenhauer had this idea that what a human being is sort of will. And will is this sort of just destructive, negative force. Yeah, that will is just a desire to eat, to, rape. It's this kind of very violent, negative thing that, if it's allowed to express itself, just causes destruction and mayhem all around it. Yeah, and Schopenhauer thought that the kind of, so we've got the phenomenal world, the world as it appears, and Schopenhauer's kind of great book is called The World as Will and Representation. Yeah, and this is a sort of he thinks he's sort of interpreting Kant. So Kant makes a distinction between the world of appearances and the world of things as they are in themselves. And Kant thinks that we don't have any access to the way things are in themselves. Yeah, and this is where I think Schopenhauer breaks with Kant. So Schopenhauer wants to keep this Kantian distinction between appearances and things as they are in themselves. But he thinks what there is in itself is something we can sort of know. Because you've got appearances, and then what lies behind the appearances is will, is striving. And Schopenhauer thinks that we can have some access into the nature of will through the nature of things in themselves, through our experience of desire. And in particular, I think he thinks that we get our kind of primary grasp of the nature of will through sexual desire. Yeah. And so that being as it is in itself is this sort of male sexual drive. So I think that for Nietzsche, I think Schopenhauer is quite explicit about this. He says that the kind of the sort of that we experience being in itself, we get our closest experience to the way things in itself through this sort of male experience of sexual desire. And Nietzsche thought, and Schopenhauer thought that will ultimately was a bad thing. Yeah, that really what was good was to not will, to in some sense overcome the will. Yeah, so he was quite inspired by these sort of Buddhist philosophy who had this idea of nirvana, and nirvana is a sort of willless state. Yeah, that according to Buddhism, that desire is suffering, because when you desire, you always lack something, and when you satisfy your desire, you just have new desire emerging. Yeah, so the best thing for the Buddhist is to not desire, because desire is pain, desire is suffering. Yeah, so we have to overcome, in some sense, desire. And Schopenhauer thinks that we can sort of overcome desire, we can overcome will through aesthetic experience, and in particular, the experience of music. Yeah, so Schopenhauer puts music on a sort of metaphysical pedestal. Going to a concert and listening to music is that one time when, in some sense, your will is quiet. Yeah, that it's in the experience of music that you have this moment of will willlessness. Yeah, and I think that Wagner kind of internalized this sort of Schopenhauerian idea. Yeah, so so he talks about the relationship between Wagner and Schopenhauer, and sorry. So I've lost the number. I'm in number 5. Yeah. So in number 5, this is on page 103, 102. He talks about, yeah. So he makes this transition in section 5 from basically Wagner to Kant. So he says you've got the theory of the sovereignty of music as Schopenhauer conceived it, music set apart from all the other arts, the independent art as such. It's an art that doesn't offer images of phenomenality. Yeah, so we sometimes get outside of the world of sense. Yeah, but rather than speaking the language of the will itself, it comes out of the abyss. Yeah, so why don't we have a break now? And then after the break, I want to then look at the next section. He's got this quite famous interpretation of Kantian aesthetics. And then after he's got this interpretation of Kantian aesthetics, he then gives this quite funny analysis of what's driving Schopenhauer. Because Schopenhauer takes the value of music to be the fact that it softens the will. Yeah. And we have this idea of sort of disinterested pleasure, but Nietzsche thinks that Schopenhauer's had a huge interest in quieting the will. So Schopenhauer had this huge kind of sexual energy that interfered with everything. And he spent his whole life trying to fight against this, yeah, to sort of, and so that the pleasure he got from, the Schopenhauer got from music was a very interested pleasure, because he had an interest in overcoming his sort of, his sexual desire. Yeah, that he was sort of driven by the interest in repressing his sexual desire. And this is why he found refuge in music. Okay, so let's have a 10-minute break, and then we'll talk about number 6. If any of you are interested in Kant's aesthetics, then sections 6 and 7, I think are fun. Okay. Again. There. Yeah, so Nietzsche and Kant. So I think the next, who's read any of Kant's, who's read Schopenhauer or knows anything about Schopenhauer? And who's read anything about Kant's aesthetics? Have you, do you know anything about Kant's aesthetics? Any thoughts? What does, no, yes. So Kant, the word aesthetics in its modern sense was first introduced by Baumgarten in in the middle of the 18th century. Kant, when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, used the word aesthetics to refer to the transcendental aesthetic that has got to do with the role of sensation and space and time in experience, and said, oh, this modern use of aesthetics to mean the kind of theory of beauty, and I'm going to forget about. But in the 1790s, he sort of gave up and he wrote the Critique of Judgment. And the Critique of Judgment, the first half of it is about what we would think of as aesthetics. The second half has got to do largely with what we might think of as something like the philosophy of biology, of living nature, of organisms. and the like. And so in the critique of judgment, Kant basically gives an analysis of two types of pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, that he thinks have some sort of a priori structure. So up until the time of the Critique of Judgment, Kant thought that pleasure and pain were just raw feelings, and there wasn't any sort of rational or a priori structure to them at all. In the Critique of Judgment, he introduces these two sort of aesthetic feelings, the feeling of the beautiful and the feeling of the sublime. Yeah, sublime, I think, is a sort of feeling that was taken up more by the romantics, and sublime has got to do with the sort of feeling of pleasure we get, I don't know, in fun fairs, horror films, the pleasure we get in watching something tragic, the pleasure we get when we see something like the pyramids or the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that's too large to take in. There's a pleasure there, but there's a sort of pain because we're sort of overwhelmed. Yeah. So the feeling of the sublime is a sort of aesthetic pleasure that involves some sort of pain. The beautiful, so I think the first half of the Critique of Judgment is his analysis of beauty. And Kant very famously says that beauty is a feeling of pleasure, but the type of the type of pleasure is a disinterested pleasure. Yeah, and this is the Kantian definition of beauty that Nietzsche is engaging with in section 6 of the it's section 7 is section sex. Yeah, it's got to do with Schopenhauer's sex life, section 7. So actually, this section 6 is also sex. It's yeah. And sex is the German for six, so maybe, I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, so Kant's got this definition of beauty as involving disinterested pleasure. I think that Kant's notion of disinterestedness involves Kant's quite specific about exactly what this disinterest is, and Kant says specifically that when you get aesthetic pleasure, you're not interested in the existence of the object that's giving you pleasure. Yeah, that all you really care about is the experience of it. Yeah, so as long as the experience continues, you're happy. Whether or not the object is real or not, that doesn't matter, because it's a pleasure you're getting from the appearance of the object, from the surface, in some sense, of the object. And so you're not interested in whether the object that's giving you this pleasure actually exists. What you're interested in is what's important is the experience continues, not that the object is in some sense real. So this is the sort of background to, yeah, I think the first sections of the third essay have quite a lot of background, because he's really engaging with Wagner, Schopenhauer, and then Kant, and he's assuming that his readers are sort of familiar with Wagner, Schopenhauer, and Kant. So he finishes section 5 by talking about how Schopenhauer ends up putting the musician on a pedestal, and I think this is why Wagner really liked Schopenhauer, because as a musician, Schopenhauer gives Wagner a lot of self-affirmation. And so Wagner buys into this pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer because it makes him feel good and important, because it puts him as the musician at the heart of this metaphysical story. Yeah, so according to Schopenhauerian philosophy, the value of the musician himself all at once went up in an unheard of manner too. From now on, the musician became an oracle, a priest, indeed more than a priest, a kind of mouthpiece of the in itself of things, a telephone from the beyond. Henceforth, he, the artist, uttered not only music, this ventriloquist of God, he uttered metaphysics. Yeah, so no wonder one day he, Wagner, finally uttered aesthetic ideals, the kind of the Wagner, late Wagner of Parsifal. Yeah, so Schopenhauer's philosophy of saying no offered a way of Wagner sort of affirming himself. Yeah, and so that Wagner appropriated this no-saying philosophy to give his life more meaning and value. Yeah, he'd rather will nothingness than will nothing at all. Yeah, that an interpretation, a nihilistic interpretation that gives one's life meaning and importance is better than no interpretation at all. This is the sort of idea. So he then moves on to talk about Kant. And so he says that Schopenhauer made use of this Kantian story of aesthetics. Is what too psychological? Nietzsche. So this is Bashak asked a question. Yeah, so let's have I mean, it is psychological. And Nietzsche thinks that we adopt interpretations in the service of our drives. So when someone adopts a particular philosophy, one has to ask what drives them to do this. Yeah. And so, you know, and I mean, one way of thinking about drives is in psychological terms. Maybe there's a deeper, more metaphysical sense of drives in Nietzsche. There's arguments amongst interpreters about the degree to which drives are to be understood kind of in strongly empirical psychological terms. But yeah, I take it, though, that this is what Nietzsche's doing. He's taking these philosophers and then analyzing their philosophical commitments in terms of their drives. And so, like, his interpretation of Schopenhauer, what drove Schopenhauer, it turns out in this section, he's very explicit about this, that Schopenhauer, when he wrote his philosophy, was a young guy in his early 20s who had this huge sexual drive that he was basically had a very negative attitude towards it. So his whole philosophy, in some sense, within the service of keeping his penis in bay. Yeah, it was all about overcoming his sexuality and his sexual drives. So I think Nietzsche is the sort of where Nietzsche went first, Freud follows afterwards. So, you know, like, think about a Freudian account of what's driving a philosopher or an artist, that we understand them in terms of, hey, all of this is just repressed sexual energy, or it's, yeah. I think Nietzsche's view is not as sort of, it's more, I think he's a subtler sort of philosopher than Freud. But I think that it's the same, yeah. So if you said, isn't this psychological? I would say yes. Isn't it too psychological? Well, yeah, it's going to be too psychological if you're driven by this will to truth. When you want to say, no, I'm interested in understanding, you know, the content of their position. Surely, you know, wasn't Schopenhauer driven by a desire to know? Now, you might think, well, maybe, but then a desire to know is just another drive. Yeah. And so if someone's driven by the desire to know, and then Nietzsche's going to say, yeah, so what's driving them? What's, you know, what are they afraid of? Yeah, like, you know, and this desire to know is going to be what he talks about in the final sections in terms of this will to truth. So the will to truth, you might think, yeah, like this is too psychological, shouldn't we care about truth? But no, Nietzsche wants to say, no, that the will to truth is another sort of drive that needs to be explained. And it's a drive that we may want to question. Yeah, and so he contrasts the will to truth with the will to deception. And so why should we take this will as this drive as sort of privileged in a certain way? Yeah, so Nietzsche's going to say why too psychological? Yeah, yeah, and once again, yeah, think about the story of genealogy. The whole project of genealogy. We've got these kind of Christian morals, and what we're looking at is their origin in drives. We're looking at the origin of Christian morality in these sort of fundamental, maybe quite unpleasant kind of drives, this drive to dominate, to cruelty, and the like. So, you know, the explaining Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, explaining Wagner in these terms, it's just another bit of genealogy, maybe. Yeah. And he's now gonna offer something similar about Schopenhauer. And it's going to be quite negative about Schopenhauer, because it's saying, well, Schopenhauer's interested because he's just this young guy who's not getting enough and who's just full of kind of pent-up sexual frustration that manifests itself in this very anti-sensualism. There's quite one of my favorite books about Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. There's this late 19th century, early 20th century kind of sociologist philosopher, one of the founders, four founders of sociology, called Simmel. Have people heard of him? He's got one book on the philosophy of money, which is sort of interesting, a big book. And he's got another book on and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And he sort of does a Nietzschean interpretation of Nietzsche. So he says that kind of, you know, Schopenhauer was just full of sexual energy and was just this vigorous kind of monster. And so, you know, in some sense, what he lacked was this sort of calmness. So he had this philosophy of denying the will, and, you know, and Nietzsche was this just little wimpy guy who he wasn't very sexually vigorous, who, you know, and so he was a little weakling. And so his philosophy was all about affirming the will and saying yes to kind of, yeah. And it's, you know, yeah, because so Schopenhauer's basic drive was to say yes to everything, to grab it, to eat it, to have sex with it. And so his philosophy is a philosophy of saying no. And Nietzsche is just this, yeah. So he has this philosophy of saying yes. It's sort of funny. Yeah. So he says, Schopenhauer made use of Kantian aesthetics, but he didn't view it with Kantian eyes, because Schopenhauer made use of Kantian aesthetics in the service of a kind of horny mid-20-year-old boy. Yeah. And so it's got he's making use of this Kantian aesthetics, but with a different drive, in some sense, dominating it. He says one thing about Kant, and I think this is quite true. He says Kant, like all philosophers, instead of envisaging the aesthetic problem from the point of view of the artist, the creator, considered art and the beautiful purely from that of the spectator. Yeah, and I think for Nietzsche, that when we're thinking about aesthetic qualities and art, really, I think Nietzsche thinks that the perspective of the artist rather than the spectator is central. Yeah, and so we should have an artist-centered art, its conception of art, rather than a kind of spectator's conception. You know, Nietzsche's philosophy, I think, his sort of ethics, I think, is heading towards a certain sort of aestheticism, where you know that he sees we should see our lives as works of art, and we should see ourselves as the artists, the creators of our own lives as works of art. And so from that perspective, what's important is the perspective of the artist, not the perspective of the spectator. So he says that that for Kant then unconsciously introduced the spectator into the concept of the beautiful. And then he has some funny kind of discussions of, he said, it would not have been so bad if this spectator had at least been sufficiently familiar to the philosophers of beauty. Like, Kant just was a bit wimpy again. Yeah, like he wasn't a very good spectator. He didn't appreciate beauty. He says that Kant's famous definition of beauty, it's a lack of any refined first-hand experience. So Kant had this sort of wimpy definition of beauty because he lacked a kind of vigorous first-hand experience of beauty. Yeah, that is beautiful, said Kant, which gives us pleasure without interest. Without interest? That's crazy. Kant. Yeah, it says, compare this with the definition, one framed by a genuine spectator and artist, Stendhal, who once called the beautiful a promise of happiness. Yeah, so Stendhal, when he's talking about beauty, is talking about the experience of a beautiful woman. Yeah, and Stendhal's just like, he sees a beautiful woman and it's just like he wants to get together with her. Yeah, and the beauty is a promise of sexual bliss. Yeah, that's what real beauty is. Real beauty is the promise of something like the orgasmic. Yeah, and I think you find this in sort of religious understandings of beauty. Think of all these medieval kind of Christian kind of accounts of this union with God. You have a lot of kind of repressed nuns who just write about their kind of ecstatic visions of God, and it's all very sexual. Yeah, it's the sort of this experience of the beautiful is something that is kind of offers a salvation, maybe. Yeah. So here he says, well, who's right, Kant or Stendhal? I think once again that once we take account of Kant of Nietzsche's perspectivalism, it looks, when you first read this, when I was first teaching Nietzsche, I thought, yeah, like, so he's dissing Kant and he's praising Stendhal. It seems to me, though, that he thinks that beauty is multifaceted. It has all of these different aspects. Yeah, so, but he does do a lot of piss taking. I think this section and the next one, I think, are quite funny in a sort of cruel sort of way. So he says, our aestheticians, never weary of asserting in Kant's favor that under the spell of beauty, one can even view undraped female statues without interest. So you have all of these men kind of in an art gallery looking at pictures of nude women and going, oh, I'm so disinterested, like, yeah. I just find the curve very well done, and it's like, come on. Yeah, one may laugh a little at their expense. Yeah. Yeah, he says the experience of artists on this ticklish point are more interesting. And Pygmalion was in any event not necessarily an unaesthetic man. So do you know the story of Pygmalion? So Pygmalion was this famous Greek artist who created a statue so beautiful that he fell in love with her. And this love was a very strong sort of sexually charged love. So he made this statue and then got really horny. And he was just so kind of upset about this that the gods made the statue alive and then they got together. Yeah, so the story of Pygmalion is the artist who creates a work of art that they fall in love with. And Nietzsche wants to stress that Pygmalion didn't kind of want to have a platonic relationship with the statue he created. but his love was sort of lustful. He created the kind of the most sexually attractive woman, and then she was a statue, so he couldn't do anything. And then the gods had to kind of relieve his agony, brought her to life. And he says that that this is the perspective of the artist. The artist, in some sense, doesn't view the art. No, you know, he's playing around with sexual desire and horniness. But I think the sort of point is that the artist isn't disinterested in their creation. Yeah, the artist is full of passion. The artist cares about what they create. The artist is full of energy. Quite a lot of it is sexual energy, and so yeah. Yeah, then he kind of, you know, he says, like, if you read what Kant has to say about the sense of touch, he talks about the sense of touch with the naivety of a country parson, of an imam. No, but imams have wives, I don't know, but of a kind of prude, someone who doesn't. Yeah, so now, so he says Schopenhauer was closer to art than Kant. So Kant was not even a good spectator. Schopenhauer really loved art. But why did he fall under the spell of Kant's definition? Yeah, he says the circumstances is remarkable enough. He, Schopenhauer, interpreted the term without interest in an extremely personal way, on the basis of one of his most regular experiences. So once again, Bashak, you might be, isn't this interpretation we're about to hear, isn't this too psychological? Yeah, like, shouldn't we be analyzing his philosophy rather than analyzing the philosopher? And I think Nietzsche wants to say, no, that this, I'm doing genealogy, and I want to find the origin of a philosophy in the sort of underlying drives. What's driving the philosopher to produce this philosophy? What drives is this type of philosophy in the interest of? Yeah. So I think Nietzsche's got the idea that all sort of philosophy ultimately is in the service of some drive or another. Yeah. And so he thinks that, he says, one of the things, few things that does Schopenhauer speak of with greater assurance than he does of the effects of aesthetic contemplation. He says that it counteracts sexual interestedness, like lupulin and camphor. So I think lupulin and camphor, these are things that they would give to soldiers to stop them getting horny, or to kind of schoolboys in boys' boarding schools. You give them some drug that stops them having sex with each other all the time. Yeah. So music is a bit like one of these drugs that dulls sexual desire. And he says, Schopenhauer never wearied of glorifying this liberation from the will as the great merit and utility of the aesthetic condition. So, like, why is music so good? What's the pleasure of music? Well, the pleasure of music for Schopenhauer is it stops you being horny for a bit. That's basically Schopenhauer. Yeah, that's kind of. And then when you read it in these terms, it looks like Schopenhauer's philosophy, it's a bit sort of deflationary. It's just saying, well, Schopenhauer's got all this grand metaphysics, but all it just comes down to is that Schopenhauer was just too horny. Yeah, and like, yeah, so he says, indeed, one might be tempted to ask whether his basic conception of will and representation, the world of ideal, you know, his whole metaphysics, the thought that redemption from the will could be attained only through representation, did not originate as a generalization from this sexual experience. And I think this is his sort of, he's putting it ironically, yeah. He says, in all questions concerning Schopenhauer's philosophy, by the way, one should never forget that it was the conception of a young man of 26. So that it partakes not only of the specific qualities of Schopenhauer, but also of the specific qualities of that period of life. Yeah. And so yeah, so yeah. So Schopenhauer's philosophy is a sort of expression. Now, yeah, so Schopenhauer uses all this Buddhist terminology. Yeah, so we have images of torment and long despair. We have this almost pathological antithesis between a moment and the usual wheel of Ixion. This is the cycle of suffering in Buddhism that and Hinduism that Schopenhauer appeals to. But he talks about the penal servitude of volition and the vile urgency of the will. And this is, I think that these, he goes backwards and forwards between these sort of semi-religious metaphysical conceptions and just plain 26-year-old oversexed Schopenhauer. And then he says, but even if Schopenhauer was 100 times right in his own case, so even if Schopenhauer music was great because it kind of gave him some peace from the kind of his sort of this scratch of sexual desire, what insight does that give us into the nature of the beautiful? Yeah. And so once again, I think one of the key sections of essay 3 is this passage we looked at a couple of weeks ago on perspectivism. Yeah, which I tied together with the discussion of the various meanings of punishment in essay 2, I think it's 13. And here, once again, I think when it comes to the beautiful, that Nietzsche wants to say there isn't one thing about the beautiful, yeah, about these sort of experiences. So he says, Schopenhauer described one effect of the beautiful, its calming effect on the will. This is one thing beauty can do. But is this a regular effect? Stendhal, as we have seen, a no less sensual but more happily constituted person than Schopenhauer, emphasizes another effect of the beautiful. The beautiful promises happiness. In some sense, it promises sexual gratification. Yeah. To him, the fact seems to be precisely that the beautiful arouses will, that is, it arouses interestedness. Yeah. And could one not finally urge against Schopenhauer himself that he was quite wrong in thinking himself Kantian in this matter? Yeah, and he doesn't understand the Kantian definition of the beautiful in a Kantian sense. So the Kantian notion of disinterested has nothing to do with sexual desire. I think Nietzsche's right about that. Yeah. And so he too, Schopenhauer, was pleased by the beautiful from an interested viewpoint, even from the very strongest, most personal interest, that of a tortured man who gains relief from torture. So Schopenhauer regarded his sexual drives as a sort of torture, and music gave him a release from torture. And what could be more interested? What could you have more of an interest in than gaining release from torture? Yeah, so insofar as music releases you from torture, then you've got a huge interest in it. Yeah, so and to return to our first question, what does it mean when a philosopher pays homage to the aesthetic idea? Well, here we get, at any rate, a first indication. He wants to gain release from torture. Yeah, so there's some suffering, and the aesthetic ideal provides us with some aesthetic ideals, give us some relief from suffering. And I think they give us a release from suffering by, I think aesthetic ideals do, by offering some sort of interpretation. Now, well, how much time have we got? We haven't got that long. I was going to skip the next sections, but as we haven't got very long, I think there's a lot of so one thing about Schopenhauer is that he treated sexuality as a personal enemy, yeah, including women. So I think Schopenhauer was a real misogynist. If you read what Schopenhauer says about women, it's all very negative. If anyone likes reading philosophical biographies, I think Schopenhauer's biography is really the funniest. There's a very fun biography by this guy called Safransky, called Schopenhauer and the Wild Years of Philosophy. Do people know the story about how Schopenhauer became a philosopher? Yeah, so his mother was really hot, really sexy, cool, and she married this much older guy who was very rich, and she gave birth to Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's dad was this, big businessman. He was a merchant in Hamburg, and Schopenhauer's dad, when Schopenhauer kind of was 17, he gave Schopenhauer wanted to become a sort of academic, a philosopher. And so Schopenhauer's dad said, listen, I'll give you two choices. Either you can go and study and be a philosopher, in which case I'll give you enough money to have to live a sort of quiet life of a student. It won't be very much, but you'll be able to get by. And, I'll give you enough money and you go off and do that. Or I will give you money to do a year-long around the world trip, holiday. And at the end of that year-long holiday, you have to come back and work in my firm and take over from me as the head of this kind of big shipping company. Yeah, so you could either become a philosopher with almost no money, or you get a free holiday and then you have to come and work in the family firm. What do you think Schopenhauer chose? He went for the holiday. Yeah, so he went for this holiday. He came back, and then shortly after he comes back, his father commits suicide. Yeah, at which point his mum is like, yes, and she runs off to Weimar and sets up a salon with Goethe and all those kind of people. So she's at the heart of this intellectual life in Weimar. And Schopenhauer, out of a sense of duty, carries on doing what he promised his dad would do. And Schopenhauer's mum is just sending her all these letters saying, oh, don't be such an idiot, Arthur. Just, you got the money now. You don't need to. And so I think one of the reasons that Schopenhauer sort of hated Kant's ethics of duty is he started off with this being a very dutiful son. And he in some sense, he had to go against what he promised his father. Yeah. But that's what he really wanted to do. And his mum was, I think he was a sort of pretty awful human being. So the letters between Schopenhauer and his mum, Schopenhauer would come to Weimar and argue with Goethe and people. And there were these letters like, Arthur, yes, you can come, but don't be such an asshole as you were last time. You're a real bore and people don't want to hear your kind of pet theory about this and that. Yeah, so Schopenhauer and the Wild Years of Philosophy is a fun biography. He threw his landlady down the stairs. Yeah, that's a famous Schopenhauer story. He needed enemies in order to keep in good spirits. Yeah. So this sort of hatred gave his life meaning. He says, if deprived of his enemies, of Hegel, of woman, of sensuality, and the whole will to existence, to persistence, yeah, without these enemies, Schopenhauer would not have persisted. Yeah, one may wager that he would have run away. But his enemies held him first. His enemies seduced him ever again into existence. Yeah, and his enemies were Hegel, women, that his own sexual desire was an enemy, but his hatred of this is what kind of filled him with vigor and made him alive, that kept him going. Yeah, so he was sort of driven by strong passion. His official doctrine was one of pessimism, of saying no to life. Yeah, but he says that without these enemies, he would have become ill. Without these enemies, Schopenhauer would have become a pessimist. And, Schopenhauer called himself a pessimist. Yeah, but Nietzsche wants to say he wasn't really a pessimist, because that it was his hatred of all these things gave him this sort of will to live. Yeah, they filled him with you know, that by saying no to his sexual desire, no to Hegel, no to kind of all these things, that this was kind of really a strong act of will. Yeah, so Schopenhauer is this sort of example he's giving of a philosopher who would rather will nothing. So this hatred of one's enemies is sort of willing nothing. It's what's driving you is a denial of these things. You're saying, I'm going to say no to Hegel. I'm going to say no to my sexual desire. No, 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 no. Yeah, that's what Schopenhauer is willing, but he's willing it strongly, and so he's not a pessimist because he's got this really strong will. Yeah. Yeah. So and we've got this philosophy that is against sensuality. Yeah. But it's sort of yeah. It's where Schopenhauer's at his most ravishing and delightful. Yep. His sort of arguments against seduction are seductive. Yeah, and we're seduced by his attack on the sort of idea of seduction. Now, once again, one last thing before I want to finish this, because we've only got 10 minutes, and so next class we'll talk about the will to truth. So once again, is he too psychological? So he says, you know, every animal, he says, instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can expand all its strength and achieve its maximal feeling of power. So this is one of the kind of Nietzsche's doctrine of the will to power. He doesn't really develop it in this book. His final book that he never finished, I think, was largely concerned with developing this idea of the will to power. But as individuals, we strive for these favorable conditions under which it can expand all of its strength and express its power. And so he thinks that philosophers, in some sense, so he's talking about philosophers and chastity now. So one form of self-denial, so we're talking about, is going to be the denial of a sexual life, this sort of will to chastity. He introduced this with Wagner at the beginning. Now he's pointing out that philosophers abhor marriage. So he looks back at all the great men of the past, the male philosophers of the past, and he says that the philosophers abhor marriage together with that which might persuade to it. Marriage being a hindrance and calamity on his path to the optimum. Yeah, so philosophers are driven, have a sort of drive. But what drives them is such that the sort of body is a sort of hindrance to what they really care about. Yeah. So on the one hand, you may think of chastity as a form of self-denial, but on the other hand, you might think of it as a form of self-affirmation, because in some sense, the philosopher is affirming. Yeah. So he says, which great philosopher has hitherto been married? Heraclitus, Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Schopenhauer, they were not. One could not even imagine them married. Like imagine Mrs. Kant. Yeah, it's a sort of, yeah, it sounds a joke. A married philosopher belongs in comedy. That is my proposition. Now, once again, apart from Socrates, I think one thing that's interesting is probably the kind of the big Western philosopher who was famously married. Who's missing from this list who was married? Any thoughts? So Aristotle, was famously married. I think it's interesting. in the Middle Ages, that you have all these pictures of Aristotle being ridden by his wife with a whip. So I don't know, Aristotle's you have this weird Aristotle dominatrix wife iconography kind of in the Middle Ages. I think Schopenhauer, yeah. So once again, is this too psychological? I think it's very gendered. It's very, I mean, he doesn't leave any room for female philosophers. I think part of that may be because the one female philosopher he really liked, Louis Salome, basically rejected him. And so maybe there's some of this kind of incel bitterness kind of finding itself expressed in Nietzsche. But I think, I don't know, if you're a woman and a feminist, I think reading what Nietzsche has to say about the philosopher seems to me fairly misogynistic. Yeah, it seems to me that it's very much seeing philosophy from a sort of male perspective. I think that's how Nietzsche, I mean, for Schopenhauer, the sort of sexual desire and trying to overcome is this very male representation of sexual desire. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we've done enough for today. Next class we're going to finish off Nietzsche. And the passage I wanted to look at was, where is it? It's 3:24-25. So for next class, have a look at, and I think you can read these things sort of a bit out of context. So this is, right towards the end, where he introduces this ideal of the will to truth. So I'm just thinking. Yeah, I think if you've got time, 23-27, with 24 and 25 being central. But I think starting at 23 is a good place to start. So I'll see you guys tomorrow and have fun. Bye-bye.